So first of all, good morning, and today is the 43rd day of the Omer. Today is Yom Yerushalayim, 28th of Iyar. Today, 52 years ago, we heard the news across the world and across, even for those who weren't born yet. The whole world reverberated with the fact that Jews, for the first time since the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 130, had control of Yerushalayim. It was a remarkable state of events.
The war started today. Yom Yerushalayim was a few days later.
I believe that Yom Yerushalayim is the day Yom Yerushalayim was captured. Today is the third day of the war, if I'm not mistaken. So what I'd like to say is that today we're going to be learning a little bit about Yerushalayim, one perspective of Yom Yerushalayim. I'd like to first of all start off by thanking Mr. Tibi Schwartz, who's sponsoring the Zecher Nishmas Leah Bas Yitzchak. Where's Tibi? Tibi, it should be Le'il Nishmas, your mother, whose yahrzeit is today by Bayom. It's a special day. It's a holy day to be to have a yahrzeit of Mitzvah Shem. It should be Le'il Nishmasa. Also like to thank Mr. David Foyer, who is sponsoring Le'il Nishmas Rachel Bas Alter Chaim Binyamin, for your mother, whose yahrzeit is just yesterday. That was we missed you in Mitzvah Shem. It should be La'aliyas Nishmasa. And also in pride and recognition of your father's anniversary of D-Day, with part of the 82nd Airborne, June 6th coming up. It's part of the reason why we had the people doing their shtadlus on the ground, literally on the beach. We're proud to be airborne, even more terrifying. Where it is a tremendous zchus to be part of that. And we also thank the Adlers who are sponsoring today, Lila Nishmas Leah Dorit Bas Shimon Kreindel, which is Mrs. Leah Adler's shloshim, which is hard to imagine that it's the shloshim for her, which is going to be tomorrow night, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, Nishmasa Eden. Her neshama should have continued earlier. We're going to learn this morning about we're going to look at two perspectives. This is a question I had a number of months ago. I'm in the journey of trying to find the answer. So I'd like to journey with you as we try to find that answer. And that is that we focus on the two times in our davening, in our siddur, that we focus primarily on Yerushalayim. There seems to be one predominant question, and that is the following. Let's just take a quick look at this. Sometimes we say this so frequently that we don't appreciate necessarily the significance of this. We say in the bracha in our Shemona Esrei, we just said it recently, for those who are about to say it, Yerushalayim ircha berachamim tashuv. What are we asking about? Hashem, return to Jerusalem in rachamim, in mercy, v'sishkon b'soicha kasher dibarta, and dwell in it as you spoke about, meaning in all the prophecies, in the Torah and in the Nevi'im, coming back to Yerushalayim, b'nei osa b'karov b'yameinu binyan olam, and you should build it b'karov soon as a eternal building. V'kisei David meir l'soichat achin, and return the seat of David to it, and establish it there. Baruch atah Hashem bonei Yerushalayim, Hashem who is the builder of Yerushalayim. So it's a remarkable bracha. It's a bracha which we all resonate with. At the same time, it's a few questions we could ask. But before we get to the question, let's appreciate it on its own ground. Who was the author of this bracha? Who wrote this bracha? So it's important. I think most people, when they go through the siddur, they don't realize that there are different parts of the siddur. So, for instance, in the Koren's siddur, what they do is they have shoulder captions. So there's a column on the right and left-hand side where they put out where the sources are, where the psukim are. In the art scroll, if it's one pasuk, then they have footnotes. If it's a whole paragraph, they have a heading. They have a header as to where it comes from. When you don't have a header, when you don't have a footnote, and when you don't have a shoulder caption, what that means to say is it isn't a pasuk. This isn't a pasuk. This did not come from some place in Tanakh, which means that means somebody composed it afterwards. Who composed it afterwards? Who penned this? So the Gemara tells us in source 1, Amalei Rav Shimon bar Abba le Rabbi Yochanan Michtei Anshe Knesses Hagdola Tiknu Lahem li Yisrael Brachos V'Tfilos Kedushois V'Havdalos. So the Gemara tells us that Anshe Knesses Hagdola were in charge of instituting a number of things, and among them were brachos, and among them were tfilos. Tfilos means the Amidah as we have it today, which means to say this goes back to the time of Anshe Knesset Agdola. What made them think that this was significant? Why did they need to do this? After all, what did people do beforehand in Jewish history? Did they not daven beforehand? It seems to be a pretty clear command in the Torah to daven. So go back to the Rishonim. What was actually going on over here? So there's a beautiful comment that Rabbi Benjamin Lau makes in the Sages, and he says the following. He says, the renewal of life in the land of Israel. Let's just put ourselves in context. This is during what's called the Second Commonwealth. This is when the Jews are now returning to the land of Israel under Persian mandate. They're allowed to build the second base of Mikdash. This is when this is all happening. That's when Anshe Knesset Agdola lived. Members of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, this body of leadership, because there was no king at this point in time. We weren't allowed a king. We weren't a sovereign state. We were subservient Persian citizens at this point in time. So in lieu of leadership being a sovereign king, we actually had two leaders. We had a governor and a Kohen Gadol, which moved its way down. And we also had Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which was this body of leadership. Included in that body of leadership were people of the likes of, who were people who were on that Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? So Shimon HaTzadik was the end. So Mordechai, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah, these folks were on this board, were on this presidium essentially that governed this state of what Israel would look like. So what at this point in time made them realize they needed to do this? So this is what Rav Lau says so beautifully. He says the renewal of life, in source 2, it should only be 2. Now the renewal of life in the land of Israel spurred the leadership to actualize the teaching of the prophets as part of the religious reform. This required the enactment of edicts, decrees, and customs. The most well-known of those deals with the institutionalization of religious life. The men of the Great Assembly enacted blessings and prayers, sanctifications, and avodas for Israel. This sentence from the Talmud embodies a wealth of material concerning the activities of the men of the Great Assembly. The single phrase, blessings and prayers, encompasses almost the entirety of our religious world. Can a person be religious without reciting blessings and prayers? Our daily routine is almost inconceivable in their absence, since one's entire daily connection to Hashem is summed up in these two words, blessings and prayers. Think about how much time our day is spent doing that. Without a blessing or a prayer, we have no stable meeting point with Hashem. And we are left only with spontaneous overtures at times of grace or joy or, heaven forbid, of crisis. The men of the Great Assembly understood that the life of simple people, far from the temple, a rural farmer perhaps, had no spiritual dimension or possibility of touching the holy. They saw that only by formalizing the relationship between the individual and his creator would all the people have access to their inner work, in the inner spiritual lives. Prayer and blessings have introduced a framework of basic religious consciousness into the religious world of the layman. This was a revolution that called upon every Jew to participate actively in the service of God, rather than simply to rely on the knowledge that sacrifices were being offered in the temple on his behalf. Beautiful perspective. Think about what they're doing. What a remarkable thing. Were they davening beforehand? Were they saying brachas beforehand? Absolutely. But it was when a person came to it organically, when they experienced that moment in their life. And when they did, they said things. So for instance, the Gemara records when a person would eat bread, they would say, Brich Rachmana Dahai Pita. Blessed be the God, Hashem, who created this bread. That's a very personal experience that they are describing. Wonderful. But in the end of the day, what happens if you weren't feeling it that morning? You hadn't had your coffee yet, right? So how would you experience? How would you be able to attune yourself to that spiritual meridian? Wouldn't happen. And by the way, with any enactments, there's always a sacrifice. There's always a cost. Meaning what they're doing is they're forcing words down our throats as well. So it's not really us. So if you think about that, there's a cost benefit. There's a cost and there's a benefit. The cost is, on the one hand, it's not our words. The benefit is, if we'd wait for our words to happen, how frequently, honestly, would we ever get there? Maybe once a month, maybe? Right? So that's the balance that Anshe Knesset Hagdolah did. This is what, by the way, any regulation has the same cost benefit. Whenever you regulate something, you lose the spontaneity. You lose the buy-in to a certain degree, but at the same time, you get something, and that something might lead to allow us to be able to invest ourselves into it. This is what Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were doing. What a remarkable revolution. Here's the question I have. The question is if you look at the text of this bracha, does it sound like Yerushalayim is built or not built? When we read the Shemona Esrei, which they wrote at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash, when there were Jews living in Yerushalayim, does it sound like it was built or not built? And it just sounds like it was not built. Yerushalayim ircha barachamim tashuv. Wait a second. They were there. The Anshe Knesset Agdola, the authors of this bracha, were living in Yerushalayim for the most part. And those who weren't, you could travel there easily as part of the Persian kingdom. So,
the Beis HaMikdash wasn't built yet.
the Beis HaMikdash was built. Chagai was the one who actually pushed it to be built. So you're right. Some of the Anshe Knesset Agdola lived beforehand. So you may say, it was in the anticipation. But before we get to the answers, I want to show you a similar pattern. Take it back a few hundred years as well. Same question as well, as an example. Birkas Hamazon. The third bracha of Birkas Hamazon, we end the bracha on a similar note. Uvenei Yerushalayim ircha v'rachamim tosh. Uvenei Yerushalayim irakodesh bimheira biyamenu. Baruch atah Hashem bonei Yerushalayim. Hashem who builds Jerusalem. Now, who is the author of this third bracha in the benching? Once again, if you open up your Siddurim, there is one pasuk which is quoted in benching, but there's nothing else which is quoted, which means somebody composed it outside of the actual text of the 24 books of Tanakh. Who composed the benching? The Gemara tells us very specifically there was a historical progression, a remarkable historical progression. Let's take a look at this. The Gemara in Brachos, which is on actually Mem Chesam Beis. For some reason I did not put the source in on this one. Amar Rav Nachman, Moshe tiken lohem liyisrael birkas hazan b'shah sheyared lohem man. Moshe Rabbeinu says, what does it mean? Hazan el sa'olam kulai b'tuva. Hashem sustains the world. He was reflecting a specific historical experience. They were in the desert, they had nothing to eat, the bread fell from the Shemaim, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, folks, let's thank Hashem who sustains the world. Hazan el sa'olam kulai b'tuva b'chen b'chesed v'rachim. Remarkable. When we're saying those words, we are not simply saying about the food on our plate, we're saying that the food on our plate is reflective of lechem in our Shemayim, which started off in the desert before they even arrived in the land of Israel. That's bracha number one. Step one of the historical progression. Step two. Yoshua tikin lohem birkas ha'aretz kevan shenichnusu la'aretz. Second bracha focuses on the fact that we have the covenant which is expressed through the land of Israel. We talk about the land, the beautiful land which Hashem gave to us. Baruch atah Hashem, on the land and the food. And of course the food is connected to the land because this is the first time we could actually sow our own food in our land. And that's how it's connected. It's a remarkable thing. Who could say that? Well, the first person who actually entered the land could say that. That's Yehoshua. Yehoshua entered the land and he said, folks, there's an extra dimension. We're not just getting sustenance from Hashem. We have the wherewithal to be able to do it. Let's thank Hashem for the land. That's stage number 2 of the progression. Stage number 3 of the progression. David u'Shlomo tiknu bonei Yerushalayim. David tiken al Yisrael amchov al Yerushalayim irecha. U'Shlomo tiken al Abayis HaGadol v'HaKadosh HaKadosh. David and Shlomo enacted the third bracha, which was about Yerushalayim and about the Beis Hamikdash. David about Yerushalayim, Shlomo about the Beis Hamikdash, and finally the most enigmatic of the brachas is the third one, which is actually not biblical, and that is the fourth one. Thank you. Hatov Ameti biyavne tiknu keneged harugei beisar da'amar of Masna oiso yom shinitna harugei beisar lekvura tiknu biyavne hatov Ameti hatov shlo yisrichu Ameti shinitna lekvura shinitnu lekvura. The fourth one was established finally when the Harugei Beisar, those who were murdered in the Beitar rebellion, the last of the Bar Kokhba bastions against the Romans under Hadrian, were killed at such a point. Their corpses were not allowed to be buried for a number of months, and when they were finally let to be buried, what day in the year was that? Tu B'Av. That was one of the 6 reasons why we celebrate Tu B'Av. This is when this was allowed, and that's why we say this fourth bracha. That's very strange. It deserves its own space and time. We're not going to get into the fourth bracha now. But be it as it may, what's fascinating is again, who are the authors of the third bracha of the benching about Yerushalayim and the Mikdash is David and Shlomo. But wait a second, although David Melech certainly didn't live at the times of the Beis Hamikdash, Shlomo did. But if you're reading the bracha, it does sound like it's a yearning again for a Mikdash which might not yet be there. So what's happening over here? I want to just do one other just a quick exercise. I think this is really remarkable, and that is that if you think about this, why is it that all I'm trying to do is eat my lunch, in Grand Central Station, before I get onto the train. Why am I talking about Israel and Jerusalem? Why is that? He has Anshe Knesset Gedolah, and they're telling me David HaMelech, and now I'm sort of, this poor little Jew is being, globally focused at this point in time. All I'm trying to do is have my bagel. Why is this the way that we act? Why is our consciousness stretched all the time? So just before we even get to some of the perspectives, here is what the Maharal says. It's a remarkable thing. I think every single time we bench, we ought to be thinking about this sphere of consciousness. Here's what he says in 4. This is in the Sivas Olam in the Siva Avoid. He says like the following. He says, "My sheyesh levarech elu gimel brachos uma inyan birkas boni Yerushalayim el birkas Amazon." What does Jerusalem got to do with the food on our plate? He says, "Hashem gave us 3 things. Perhaps we'll call it hierarchy of needs, maybe, right? Before Maslow arrived at the scene, this is a pyramid of needs. He says, Number 1 is a person needs basic sustenance. That's what a person needs. Basic level is we need something every 3 hours or so in order to be able to survive comfortably without complaining. Vasheni, noisaf alze, shenosan la'adam ha'echrechi kach nosan lahem ha'oretz ha'tova v'umuvoreches b'chol ad ki yesh lahem af davar she'eno ha'echrechi. So then Hashem gives us not just survival, we're not just going from meal to meal, we also have space. We also have our own place. Think about that. There's a difference between a person who is able to survive from meal to meal, and a person who has their own abode. The difference between perhaps a couple who are renting, and the moment that they're able to buy and be able to settle down. The difference between having space. That's number 2. And he says it's not basic to essential living, but it's the revacha, it's the space to exist. That's the second bracha. Then Hashem invested not just survival, not just thriving, but also ultimate spiritual success, which is encompassed in the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Maharal, the ultimate success in any physical endeavor will be if there's a spiritual dimension to it. Because ultimately the physical world is only so big. It can only be successful for so long, and the enduring experience is only so limited. That real bracha, real explicit, we'll call it expansion, stopped the moment Yerushalayim was destroyed. And that was, at the time that the Beis HaMikdash was around, it was almost like sort of a portal of access. For all spiritual bracha would come through that place to the rest of the world. So when a person is benching, what they're saying is they're talking about levels of success. If you think about the pyramid of needs, Hashem allow us to survive. Hashem allow us to thrive. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu open that portal of access, whether it be in the global world's eyes or in our personal lives, where we can access spiritual bracha. Rav Kook takes it one step further. Rav Kook, in many ways, his machshava is an extension in so many ways of the Maharal. There's so many brilliant ideas that he says. And he says it's not just every individual is living this and thinks about these 3 dimensions of their life, but actually it's a historical progression in the reverse. The Gemara talked about how there's a historical progression from Moshe to Yoshua to David and Shlomo. Rav Kook says it's the opposite in terms of our aspirations. And this is such a profound insight into history. He says the following in the 5th source. He talks about how, in source 5 at the top of the page, a little small writing, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. He says, Veracious kahakol, it's from the comma in the middle of the line. Sorry, this is in Olas Riyah, his commentary on the Siddur, on the benching. Veracious are called Tzorich hakiyum hagufani b'haprati. First, a person needs physical survival. V'acharav hakiyum hagufani haklali. Then the movement is not about space, as the Maharal talks about it, but we'll call it thriving of not just my individual body, but the national body needs to thrive. on tzrichim la'aschil es hisyastus tzuraso hapratis shel ha'uma be'ercho la'atzmo lekiyuma v'tzivyona. That needs to be establishment of what it looks like to be a nation again. V'achach tager ha'tzura ha'klalis be'ercho l'chol hamon ha'goyim b'ruei tzelem elokim. Ona b'meshach ha'golos cholav chorad kol el ele his avdus. His avdus, I think that is. Acharei shechanenu nidkoim bahamon tzuros upizurim noraim sheloi tiposeid chalila hatzura hapratis me'uma. So what he says is, Bekitzur, is the following, is that through the process of Golus, we've lost three things. And therefore, the process of Geula is going to represent all of those three things. We've lost, in a certain sense, our own identity as people, as Jews. We've lost our national identity as a Jewish nation. And we've lost our spiritual identity as what it means to be the Jewish nation. And therefore, he says, in the process of Geula, we're going to witness them in reverse. We're going to see, first of all, what it means to say that the Jews suddenly return to their identity. We're going to then see that they're going to reestablish the nation of Israel, and by the way, connected on the land of Israel. But it's going to still be, at that point in time, devoid of spiritual content. And then on that platform, as Rav Kook always says, that's the first step. That's why he celebrated the Chalutzim. That's why he celebrated the people who risked their lives and gave their lives to make this land. And people say, yes, it was irreligious people. And his answer is, yes, that is the steps towards Geula, because the next bracha is B'Rachein. The next bracha is Yerushalayim. The next bracha is the spiritual content. First, we need to have the first two steps. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be part of Klal Yisrael, even without religious identity? What does it mean to be part of a Jew who lives in the land and has a religious identity? So he views it as actually the historical progression back into the land of Israel, which is those three steps. We're not going to get into how both the Maharal and Rav Kook looked at the fourth bracha, because that's a Golistic bracha as to what HaTov HaMetiv is and why specifically that right now. Be it as it may. At this point in time, question back on the table, and that is why is that we're asking and requesting for a Yerushalayim at times specifically when the first Beis HaMikdash was being built and the second Beis HaMikdash was being built. That's when the benching is talking, and that's when our Shemona Esrei is talking. Why would we be asking at such points in time? So as Rabbi Eliezer correctly said, the first answer should be simple. The one way of looking at it is that the brachas changed over time. So for instance, the Rashba, in his commentary on the Gemara in Brachos, says the following. We're not going to read the whole of the Rashba, but in source 6, the Rashba tells us, at the very, very end, of source 6, I bolded it, he says, says the Rashba, when David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech were Mesakeh in this bracha, when they instituted this bracha, what was their bracha? Their bracha was, Hashem, please preserve Yerushalayim. Please allow it to continue. Allow our Malchus to be successful. What happened was that over time, that was no longer a relevant bracha because Yerushalayim simply wasn't there. So therefore, it was adapted to be what we talk about today, which is fill the void. There is no Yerushalayim. Hashem build Yerushalayim. Right? So therefore, there was a shift over history, which makes a lot of sense. Similarly, we could potentially answer, although the Rashba does not comment on the bracha of Yerushalayim Yercha in the Shemona Esrei, potentially as well. It could have been that bracha as well, over time, was adapted to because of the fact that we no longer had a Yerushalayim, which we had access to. Potentially answer number one. So Eliezer, check one, right? We're good. Okay, that is the Rashba. And the Rashba makes a whole lot of sense. But let's take it further. There's another way of looking at this. And I heard murmurings. And the reason why this is a very important murmuring, and that is that I'd like to come back to one perspective, and that is Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. We've learned this a little bit beforehand, but he has a beautiful, beautiful piece, a beautiful essay in Parashas Boy in Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Beis, and he asked the following. We learned this a little while back together. And that is the Ramban tells us that when we left Egypt, we changed the way we count our days. We changed the calendar. What did we do? Instead of counting from the time of creation, from the month of creation being the point of reference to the beginning of the year, which is Tishrei, we started counting our Chodesh Harishon from Exodus. And therefore, says the Ramban, enigmatically, he says, and similarly, when they left Bavel, when they left Babylon, they took with them the months of the Babylonian year. And so Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky says, I just don't understand. He says, wait a second. When it came to leaving Egypt, counting from the Exodus was an expression of Geula. I'm counting from the time that I left behind Egypt. But when I'm counting the Babylonian names, I'm essentially not talking about my redemption. I'm remembering my exile. Right? I believe the Osirik reactor, the whole area was called Tammuz 17, right? These are Babylonian names, folks. This is not, it's not Jewish. When you're thinking about those names, and we still say them today, the Molad yesterday was announced on Sivan. Sivan is not a Jewish name. So why are we borrowing back to a time of Golus? It's not parallel, says Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. So his argument is the following. He quotes the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says in Yuma, it talks about at a certain time in the base. The Mishnah says that the second base of Mikdash there were a number of things that were lacking from the second base of Mikdash. One of them was the Aron. That means to say, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the center of the base of Mikdash, there was no Ark of the Covenant. And in fact, the Mishnah records that there was a particular Kohen in Masechah Shkolim in Perek Vav Mishnah Aleph. It talks about there was a Kohen Echad, there was a young man who was looking at the base of Mikdash, and he noticed that the tile work was a little off, and he wanted to investigate. He believed that maybe he found a special passageway to where the lost ark was, and he died. And they realized, wait a second, maybe this is not the best thing to do, and they made a movie about this, right? So that means to say that they realized that it wasn't the right time to bring out the ark yet. And in fact, around all of this, around this whole discussion, is in fact also missing was the Shekhinah and overt miracles. Right? There was the second base of Mikdash was a much more diminished experience. So says Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, if you take a look at the very back of our notes today, the second to last page, this is the Emes Liakov. In the bottom left corner, I put a 1, which is where he continues his thoughts, and he says the following: Nireh, she'oile Bavel, shebanu es bayis hasheni. Those who built the second base of Mikdash, included among them the Anshe Knesset Gdola, Yadu kiloi ze habinyan asher yamod lo'elamim. They knew this was not going to be it. They knew this was not going to be successful. Ve'ein chazarasam le'eretz Yisrael b'tekufa zu hagula hashlema. This was not the ultimate redemption. Da'atam hoysaz ki binyan abayis b'tekufa zois lo noad ela la'achines ha'am le'tekufa sagolus arucha. It was provision along the way to help us today, in the year 2019, still survive throughout the 2000-year or the 1900-year Golus. Now, Pishura Sadin, Hayem Tzrichim Lishai Bavel, Oid Zman Rav. They did not deserve to leave Bavel. Elo Shirasa Hashkocha, Shekfar La'achar Shivim Shana Shel Golus Bavel, Kfar Nitma V'Nisarev Roiv Ha'am Im Hagoyim. They realized that there was such assimilation after the small 70 years with the nations around them. Ubaru kashemesh hoya, it was clear as daylight. Ki'im yisakvu b'nei Yisrael b'golus me'ois v'alfei shanim. If they stay any longer, shar she'az b'vadai lo yatzliach ha'am li'ishai b'zeusai hamyuchedes. They realized they would no longer be able to hold on to their identity. V'shuv lo yiyeh es mi lig'ol. There would be no one left to redeem. V'lachein chamal Hashem alamoy v'oitziam mibavel ve'chziram. Therefore Hashem returned them ba'oven zmani, in a temporary way, le'eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. Ubana lahem es beis ha'bechira, and he built them a new beis hamikdash. V'akol bichdei sheyashuvu v'yischazku b'yesod ha'imuna v'yeh mechusanim likras tekuvas hagolus hamara, that they should be able to live and succeed in a very long and bitter exile, which is where we are today. That we should be inoculated from all the sorrows of the Golus. Bichdei lahadgish ulahamchish la'am shadayin heim lo nigalu v'chi be'etzem adayin heim beGolus. And in order to emphasize the fact that they had not yet left the woods, lo yehelu sa'aron. That's why they did not bring out the Aron into the second Beis Hamikdash. Makora kedusha bebayis rishon, which was the source of the kedusha in the first Beis Hamikdash. Mimakom shenignaz v'yishiru b'mukoymoi ki adayin ein hageula shlema, because it was not yet full. Now, by the way, he hasn't explained. So how is that? How is the second Beis Hamikdash that inoculation for the Golus? Meaning, say, like it's almost a teaser, right? You can come back, but it's not the real deal, and you go out again. So what really happened during this time? So he says in a footnote, this is a very important footnote, he says, in 17, Bechidushav, this is his Talmudim point out, that they quote him on Pirkei Avos. He also has a beautiful essay there. Bechidushav Pirkei Avos, B'yer Rabbeinu, shechelek me'asiba she'echziram ne Hashem yisborach le'eretz Yisrael, oz ha'yisa b'shvil she'yuchlu le'asoif v'la'aroich es ha'Torah shebal peh. They needed the land of Israel in order to be able to reestablish the Torah shebal peh. Meaning, what Anshe Knesset Agdola were doing, the foundations of the Mishnah, ultimately were being laid at this point in time where they needed to have a sovereign space to be able to do this in order to create that, we'll call it framework, necessary to be able to survive Golus. Ki yada hashkacha shebishvil lahachzik ma'amad beGolus shuv sharti ha'Torah shebal peh nachal pratis shel chachmei Torah. They knew that no longer was it going to be that the ideas of Judaism, the fundamental underpinnings, could be in the hands of simply just leaders, individuals, Yechidei Skula, Nevi'im, Elohaya muchrachas liyos nachalasom shel kol b'nei Yisrael. It needed to be part of everybody. V'lochein gam amdu oz v'gozru al pitom v'al shamnom. They said, you know what, we can't just have meals we can't eat the bread, the wine, all the different gzeros of non-Jews. We can't just eat these things, even if they're 100% kosher. So they made certain provisions that we wouldn't be able to get, we wouldn't assimilate. And therefore he says, and by the way, it is a fascinating addition over here. He says that might be also a perspective. Now, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was by no means a Zionist, right? He did not come from that world. He says, but the Torah does, Rosh Hashiva. But he says, but maybe that's a perspective to appreciate the land, the land of Israel. That after the terrible desolation which we witnessed, and after the destruction of the Russian Jewry as well, he says it was a sort of provision and ability to, now that's minimalistically. What? That's what's in the footnote. But if you think about this as a remarkable perspective, means it was our ability to be able to get through. It was the chizuk given necessary. That doesn't mean to say that it's not. It still means to say we're still in Galus, but it means to say that it's a step up. We're getting towards being able to be hopefully at the real Geula Shlema. But with this perspective, he says that's why it is. Going back to the Ramban, that's why we adopted the names of the Mount of Bavel. Why? Specifically to educate people that this is not. We're not out of the woods yet. We're still in Babylonian Galus, but we have an addition now. We're in the land of Israel with the Beis Mikdash. As an example, he says that's why, as well as coming back to you, Eliezer, in the prophecies of Yechezkel gave very specific instructions how to build the Beis Hamikdash in the future. And when they built the Beis Hamikdash at the times of Anshe Knesset Agdola, at the times of Chagai and Zechariah, their floor plans were different to the ones that Yechezkel before him had given them. Wait a second. If Yechezkel told you how to build the Beis Hamikdash, then listen to him. Why are you building something which looks different? And the answer is they realized that they weren't at the times of Yechezkel yet. They realized that even though Yechezkel talked about this futuristic building, they were not yet at the end of the journey. And they were only at a provisional state, which is why they built the Beis Hamikdash as a much more smaller and modified version of the first Beis Hamikdash, not the third Beis Hamikdash, even when they were building it. Which may be why, if you think about it, yes, Anshe Knesset Agdola were Masake and instituted the bracha of Yerushalayim Yercha Berachamim Tashuv V'Sishkam B'Socha Kasher Dibarto. It could have been they were referring to a built Yerushalayim, but the Yerushalayim was still deficient. It was still deficient. It was missing the Shechina. It was missing the Aaron. It was missing the basic wherewithal of what it looked like in the Bayis Rishon. They knew they were still in Golus, so therefore they instituted a bracha which would reflect itself throughout all of Golus. That potentially is another way of looking at this. Let's take it one step further, because at this point in time I'm feeling rather depressed. Because yes, means that even when they're saying the bracha, we're still even at that point in time they were still missing it. So we looked at two ideas. Maybe the bracha itself was adapted over time to reflect the realities, as the Rashba suggests, or potentially it was coined at a time where they were still, even though they had the physical trappings and buildings of Yerushalayim and it looked remarkable. I mean, today when you go to Yerushalayim, it's never the same. You leave there for a year today, it's a different Yerushalayim. Every time you come back, it's remarkable. Yerushalayim is flourishing, but it's still missing. It's still missing the inner core. Right? That's what they were experiencing at the same time, at the beginning of Bayis Sheni. I think there's one other idea, and this is something I mentioned briefly at Shalosh Shudas yesterday, but I think it's to me is a remarkable idea. And that is that although Judaism values Yerushalayim at the center, the epicenter of everything that we talk about, in the end of the day, the Torah never really actually identifies Yerushalayim specifically. Nevi'im and Ksuvim, it's replete, hundreds, thousands of times does the Torah talk about it. But in the Torah itself, there are vague references. And we spent some time a few years ago looking at all those vague references and how they come together to express Yerushalayim itself. In fact, when the Torah talks about going to this place, you're going to bring korbanos. It says, you shall go to Yerushalayim to find this place, and that's when you're going to bring your korbanos. But tell us where that place is. Why doesn't the Torah specifically tell us where that place is? We're waiting. We're on the cusp. We're on Arvos Moav. We're on the steps of Moav, looking into the land of Israel. Tell us where that place is. Why is it this vague reference? And so of course, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim tells us a basic pragmatic step, and that is that the moment that the non-Jews know where the center of Judaism what happens? They all take it. Look at it today. You put a camera up in the corner, and there's riots. Right? It's probably the most contested piece of real estate in the entire known world. Right? So Hashem says, I'm going to make sure that you're going to get into the land of Israel first. Once you've settled down and you conquered the land, then I'll tell you where it is. We're not going to let anybody else go and put their flags there. Right? And by the way, once we left, that's exactly what happened. Right? In the times of the second Beis Hamikdash, the Samaritans who weren't Jewish were quite happy to, let's do a joint project here. We'll be a joint venture. We'll all sacrifice to our gods together. And the Jews said, no, thank you. And that's when they started sending letters to Persia. Right? It's been a problem. Ever since Hashem said He wanted to avoid that problem beforehand, which is why He made it vague. The Rambam also says maybe it was not about the non-Jews, it was about us. Because imagine that we're all standing on the banks of the Jordan. There's 12 tribes, and they're Jews. And Hashem says to them, that there's going to be this amazing place. It's going to be, the portal of access between the spiritual and the physical. And everybody says, but where did you say whose portion was it in exactly? So what's going to happen? There's going to be an onslaught. Everybody's going to run in, it'll be like the gold rush, the Jordan will split, and everybody running straight to Yerushalayim with their tribal flag. So there's one extra dimension, that is like this, is that the process of moving towards Yerushalayim, as is described in Dvarim, when it talks about this, L'shichna sidrushu v'as Hashem, the word it uses, L'shichna sidrushu. Drisha means to say, how do you translate that word? Seeking, right? Yerushalayim is always meant to be sought out. Yerushalayim is meant to be the eternal journey towards it and never really quite arriving. Which is why, by Avram Avinu had the same process. Hashem says to him, Lech lecha al eretz HaMoriah, take your son to this land, the land of Amoriah, va'aleu sham la'ola al achad ha'orim, asher amar elecha. It's going to be one of the Hashem couldn't give him the GPS address for the ways. He could have just made it a little simpler. The answer is no. Yerushalayim is always a process of moving towards. It's always a place of seeking out further. Even at the times where we had Yerushalayim, we never quite arrived. Yerushalayim is always distant. Yerushalayim is always a mountaintop we are moving towards. It's never quite there. That's what it means. Even at the times the Beis Hamikdash was there, David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech had it. It was always about Bonei Yerushalayim. What tense is Bonei Yerushalayim in ultimately? It's in the present tense. It means to say Yerushalayim is always regenerating. It is always growing. It is always being elevated. That is the process of Yerushalayim. In fact, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has a beautiful book called Future Tense. And he has a few essays. This is a comment on it. And he points out that Judaism is always a forward-looking religion. He has a quote for it. It is no accident that so many Jews are economists fighting poverty, or doctors fighting diseases, or lawyers fighting injustice. In all cases, refusing to see things as inevitable. Listen to this remarkable quote, this next line. It is no accident that after the Holocaust, Jews did not call it al-Nakba, nursing resentment and revenge, but instead turned to the future, building a nation whose national anthem is Atik for the hope. It is no accident that Judaism has been opposed by every empire and sought to deny people the freedom to be equal but different. It is no accident that Israel is today the only free society in the Middle East. Judaism is a religion of details, but we miss the point if we do not sometimes step back and see the larger picture. To be a Jew is to be an agent of hope in a world serially threatened by despair. Every ritual, every mitzvah, every syllable of the Jewish story, every element of the Jewish law is to protest against escapism, resignation, or the blind acceptance of fate. Judaism is a sustained struggle the greatest ever known against the world that is, in the name of the world that could be, should be, but is not yet. There is no more challenging vocation. Throughout history, when human beings have sought hope, and they have found it in a Jewish story. Judaism is the religion, and Israel the home of hope. In the words of Rav Mank on the Siddur, when describing the Birkas Hamazon, this is actually quoted in the Siv Bina, he says the following, Harav Mank, Bepirushoy alo azibas le-Siddur says, Me'ir al azmanim shalem musabim abrochos. Es ha'arabah, he says the following, quote, HaBrocha Rishona, the first bracha in Birkas Hamazon, he kula bizman haveh, is all about present, we're being sustained. Hashniya beloshen avar, the second one is about, you gave us the land, that's in the past. The third bracha is a focus on the future. When we talk about Bonei Yerushalayim, even when we're in Yerushalayim, it's always about the future. Because in Judaism, we never arrive. We continue to aspire, we continue to grow. Yes, we've seen remarkable growth, but folks, we never for 1 minute rest on our laurels. We continue to darav, we continue to aspire, and therefore the statement is always true. Even when we know Yerushalayim is the Shechna Sidrashu, we continue seeking there to find deeper, even if not geographically different. And which Emetz Hashem, it should be a time where we see the Geula Shleim Be'er Her Yameinu. Rabbi Chane ben Akasha Amar Atzal Kodesh Baruch Hu Zakos Yisrael Leficha Achir Bolem Torah Mitzvah Shneimar Adonai Chafetz Aman Tzikha Yagdil Torah V'Yadir.